Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on President Eisenhower.
Oh yeah.
And specifically his civil rights record.
Interesting.
It's really a fascinating topic, I think.
Yeah.
So many twists and turns.
It is.
And the source that we're using for this deep dive is a history podcast episode called Eisenhower's Civil Rights Acts. Reluctant Reformer or Strategic Leader, which is a pretty good title.
Yeah, very intriguing.
It should give us a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great episode, or a great deep dive, I should say, for anyone who is curious about how personal beliefs can sometimes clash with a president's actions.
Especially.
During pivotal moments in history.
Yeah, in times of change.
Exactly.
Huge change.
Yeah.
Eisenhower is
Go ahead.
He's a really interesting case study.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, he might not seem like a major player in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily put him in the top 5 or something.
Yeah, yeah. But when you look closer, his presidency definitely had a lasting impact.
Yeah, and that's what our source is really trying to unpack. I think it starts by sort of painting this picture of Eisenhower as somebody with some pretty intricate views on race and segregation. And so personally, he wasn't a big fan of social integration.
Interesting.
And then his Republican ideology, generally favored a limited role for the federal government when it came to social issues.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a...
So that's happening right as the civil rights movement is...
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Gaining momentum.
Oh, that's an interesting...
So it's a really interesting time.
This president who's trying to navigate his own personal beliefs and the political realities of the time.
Right.
And the increasing pressure for change.
Yeah.
Go,
he's got to be.
Pulled in so many directions. Yeah. It was real balancing act. And there's this quote from the source where Eisenhower privately said that he couldn't see himself mingling socially with Black Americans. And I thought that was...
It's a stark reminder that even though he supported equality, in principle, he was still a product of his time.
Right. And it really stuck with me.
Yeah.
That quote.
I can see
it was almost as if he was wrestling with himself.
Yeah.
Intellectually, he understood the need for equality.
Yeah.
But emotionally, he was a product of his time.
Yeah.
It's like...
Do you think many people struggled with
similar
internal conflicts?
Ask that.
Back then and maybe even today?
Yeah. Do you think people... Do you think a lot of people were conflicted back then?
We all grapple with, to some extent, right?
Yeah.
How do our personal beliefs align with what we know is right?
Yeah.
And how do we act on that?
And how do you act on that?
It's particularly challenging when you're in a position of power.
Oh, yeah.
Like Eisenhower was.
Absolutely.
Right.
So when the Brown v. Board of Education decision came down in 1954, declaring school segregation unconstitutional, how did Eisenhower react?
The source describes his response as muted.
Muted.
He understood the legal implications of the decision, but he was deeply concerned about potential backlash and violence against communities. If desegregation happened too quickly.
Oh, I see. So
he was worried about...
He even said that he thought desegregation would cause great emotional strains for the country. Great emotional strains.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder.
Right. Has everybody at some point...
Everyone at some point felt conflicted about...
Conflicted about a social issue.
A social issue.
Where maybe your personal beliefs don't perfectly align.
Your personal beliefs?
With the quote-unquote right course of action?
Didn't perfectly align with the right course of action.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty...
I'm just thinking of universal experience.
If everybody has
gone through that,
this internal conflict, played out on a national stage,
and he's got
with huge consequences,
the whole country watching him.
Yeah. So
it seems like there was a disconnect between his personal views,
a real disconnect,
and what was happening.
His personal views and what was happening in the country
at that time.
But
despite his reservations.
But the source is saying that despite his reservations,
About widespread.
About widespread.
Social integration.
Social integration.
Yeah.
Eisenhower did take some steps to address racial discrimination.
Did take some steps to address.
At least within the federal government.
Racial discrimination.
So he's willing to do something.
Within the federal government.
Yeah?
Yes. And this is where things start to get interesting.
Okay.
Eisenhower worked somewhat behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
To eliminate discriminatory hiring practices within federal agencies.
I see.
So while it wasn't
That's interesting.
a sweeping change,
so he's
has an important signal.
He's willing to make change where he has control.
Yes.
But maybe not.
Exactly. For example, in 1953,
bigger national.
He created the President's Committee on Government Contracts.
Okay, can you tell me more about that?
The committee was
So the President's Committee on Government Contracts.
Designed to prevent discrimination by companies that had contracts with the federal government.
So like if you want to work with...
So it was a symbolic step.
The federal government, you have to follow these rules that racial inequity in employment was an issue that the government needed to address.
That makes sense.
Right.
But our source also mentions that the committee lacked real enforcement power.
Right, and that highlights
kind of
a recurring theme in Eisenhower's approach to civil rights.
Like a symbolic thing.
Cautious progress.
Yeah.
With limited federal intervention.
Okay, so he wasn't exactly leading the charge for sweeping change.
He wasn't exactly leading the charge, but he also wasn't completely inactive.
These actions
within the government were important.
But
the real turning point came with broader legislation.
Enter the Civil Rights Acts.
Okay.
Which really put Eisenhower's beliefs and political maneuvering to the test.
Right. So that's where we really see him having to make tough decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. The Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960.
Okay.
Those were huge milestones. I mean, they're the first pieces of federal civil rights legislation passed.
Wow.
Since Reconstruction. Which had ended almost a century earlier.
So a long time coming.
Yeah.
But passing those acts couldn't have been easy, right?
Of course not.
Especially with the resistance.
From Southern lawmakers.
That
wanted to maintain
segregation.
Right.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
So let's start with the 1957 Act.
Okay.
Which mainly focused on protecting voting rights for Black citizens in the South. Back then.
Yeah.
Things like literacy tests.
Right. And poll taxes were commonly used to
stop people from voting.
Disenfranchise Black voters.
Yeah.
And this act aimed to tackle that.
Okay. Yeah. So sounds like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
What exactly
did it do?
Yeah. What exactly did the 1957 Act put into place?
What did it actually do?
It established the Civil Rights Division within the Department of Justice, giving the federal government more power to investigate instances of voter discrimination.
I see.
It also created the Civil Rights Commission, which was tasked with studying civil rights violations and issuing reports on their findings. So
sounds like it was setting up a system for accountability.
Yeah, a system for accountability.
But I have a feeling there were roadblocks along the way.
Unfortunately, yes.
Right.
Southern senators.
Yeah.
Particularly Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time.
Right. Managed to weaken the bill through amendments. One key detail our source highlights is that they removed the provision granting the Justice Department greater enforcement power.
Oh, so even though the act was passed, it lacked the teeth to truly make a difference.
It lacked the teeth.
It was symbolic.
Exactly. Without strong enforcement mechanisms, the 1957 Act ended up being largely symbolic. It signaled that the federal government was starting to pay attention to civil rights. But it wasn't enough to bring about real change on the ground.
Right.
And this brings us to the 1960 Civil Rights Act, which tried to address
So what did the 1960
some of those shortcomings
do differently?
It focused on bolstering those enforcement mechanisms against voter suppression.
Got it.
For example, it empowered federal judges to appoint referees to oversee voter registration.
I see.
In areas with a history of discrimination It also mandated that states
Smart.
keep their voting records, making it easier to investigate
That makes sense.
any allegations of discrimination.
Yeah.
So,
Did it manage to overcome
well, not entirely.
the resistance?
While the 1960 Act represented some progress, Southern opposition remained strong.
Okay.
This really highlights that
So still an uphill battle.
passing a law is just the first step.
Right.
Real change requires committed enforcement and continued pressure from the public.
It's a great point.
To ensure those laws have a genuine impact.
That's a crucial point.
Right.
It shows how political maneuvering can weaken even
political maneuvering,
well-intentioned legislation.
can weaken even well-intentioned legislation.
And that's a lesson that's still relevant.
And it's a lesson.
So many issues today.
That's still relevant to so many issues today.
So we've seen how Eisenhower tried to address civil rights through legislation. But I'm curious about how he handled specific events on the ground.
On the ground. Our source delves into the Little Rock crisis of 1957. The Little Rock crisis, which seems like was a defining moment.
A turning point.
But both Eisenhower
in his approach to civil rights.
And the nation.
Right.
Remember, this was the same president who had previously stated he wouldn't use federal troops to enforce desegregation.
He wouldn't do it.
But the situation in Little Rock
forced his hand.
Little Rock happens.
Yeah.
Can you remind us about what happened in Little Rock?
Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus called in the National Guard to block 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School.
So the governor of Arkansas,
that's active defiance,
called in the National Guard
against the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board.
So created a constitutional crisis.
Black students from going to school.
That Eisenhower couldn't ignore.
Wow.
Yeah.
That put him in a really tough spot.
It put him in a really tough spot.
He had to choose between upholding
federal authority
and risking further
federal authority,
racial tensions in the South.
And risking further racial tensions in the South.
And in the end, he chose to uphold federal authority.
And in the end, Eisenhower chose to uphold federal authority.
So
on September 24th, 1957, he issued Executive Order 10730. Placing the Arkansas National Guard under federal control.
So he took control of it.
He then sent in
National Guard,
the 101st Airborne Division.
Wow, he sent in the Army.
To escort those 9 black students into the school.
He sent in the Army.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
And in a televised address to the nation, Eisenhower explained that he felt a constitutional duty to enforce the Supreme Court's decision and maintain order.
So even though he had personal reservations about desegregation.
He had personal reservations about desegregation.
He ultimately felt obligated to act.
The
Little Rock crisis demonstrates.
The Little Rock crisis demonstrates the constant tension between personal beliefs and the responsibility to uphold the law, especially during periods of significant social change.
A great example of that.
It also highlights the power of the presidency to enact change, even in the face of resistance.
And it really underscores the impact of those.
It really underscores the impact
of those earlier actions. Like creating the Civil Rights Division.
And Civil Rights Commission.
And Civil Rights Commission. If those hadn't been in place.
Would
he have had the tools to act?
Would he
so decisively
have had the tools to act so decisively in Little Rock? That's a great question.
Right.
And it's something historians continue to debate.
Yeah, I bet.
Was Eisenhower
he
laying the groundwork?
Laying the groundwork all along?
For more forceful action all along?
Or was this just the thing that made him do it?
The Little Rock.
Yeah.
The true catalyst that pushed him to take a more active stance on civil rights.
I guess that's part of the complexity of history, right?
Great question.
We might never know for sure what was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, we might never know.
But speaking of different interpretations.
Of history. Our source mentions that historians have some pretty diverse views on Eisenhower's civil rights legacy.
It's not a
simple answer, is it?
Simple answer, right?
Not at all. There are at least
a lot of different
4 major schools of thought, each offering.
So could you?
A different perspective on his actions and motivations.
break those down.
Of course.
For us.
Dude, you have the traditionalist school.
Traditionalist.
Who view Eisenhower as a conservative pragmatist.
Okay, so they
acknowledge
that he may not have been eager to embrace sweeping change.
Conservative pragmatist.
But they see his actions,
okay,
especially the Civil Rights Acts, as genuine, albeit cautious progress.
So slow but steady progress.
Essentially, they argue that Eisenhower, in his own way, laid the foundation for the advancements in civil rights that will come later.
So they see him as a bridge builder in a way,
right?
Connecting earlier efforts with the later, more sweeping changes of the 1960s.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Then there's the continuity school.
Continuity school.
Who view Eisenhower's presidency as part of a longer arc of civil rights progress.
Got it.
They see his actions as building on.
So they're seeing it more.
The decades of work by groups like
the NAACP
and paving the way for the landmark legislation of the 1960s.
Yeah.
Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right.
For them, it's all about understanding the historical context and seeing how each step, even a small one, contributes to larger societal shifts.
I got it.
You know.
So we have those who see him as a pragmatist making slow but steady progress, and those who see him as part of a longer chain of events.
Yeah.
What are the other two?
The next one is
schools of thought.
The revisionist school.
Revisionist school.
And they take a much more critical stance.
Right.
They argue that Eisenhower lacked a genuine moral commitment to civil rights.
Okay, so
they point to
critical
his reluctance to directly confront Southern resistance and his relative silence on events like the murder of Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott as evidence that he was more concerned with maintaining order and stability than with actively pushing.
And so for them, it's about looking beyond
for racial equality.
The actions he did take.
Precisely.
And considering things he chose not to do.
We have the Legalist school.
Legalist school.
They focus on the limitations of the Civil Rights Acts that Eisenhower signed into law. They argue that the 1957 and 1960 acts were simply not strong enough to dismantle the deeply entrenched systems of segregation and discrimination in the South. And that stronger
enforcement mechanisms were needed from the start.
So they're highlighting the gap between good intentions and actual impact, which seems like a recurring theme
in an Eisenhower
approach to civil rights.
These different perspectives.
It's really interesting.
It makes you realize that history.
Hear these different perspectives. It makes you realize that history isn't just a set of facts.
A set of facts.
It's about interpretation and debate.
It's about interpretation and debate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's important to consider
It's important to consider
different viewpoints.
All these different viewpoints.
To get a more nuanced and complete understanding.
To gain a more nuanced and complete
of Eisenhower's legacy on civil rights.
Understanding of Eisenhower's legacy on civil rights.
So after taking this deep dive into Eisenhower's civil rights record. What's the main takeaway for our listener?
Into Eisenhower's civil rights record.
What do you hope they'll walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history is rarely black and white.
Right.
Even figures we think we know well. Like Eisenhower can surprise us with their complexities and contradictions.
He was a complicated guy.
He wasn't a fiery civil rights champion.
Right.
But he also wasn't completely inactive.
He
did some progress.
The best he could.
But it was often cautious and limited.
Or the situation.
And understanding those complexities is key to having a more accurate and meaningful grasp of the past.
It's a good reminder to always be curious.
Absolutely.
Always dig a little deeper.
It's about.
And be open to the idea that there's always more to learn.
Embracing those shades of gray.
Even about.
And recognizing that the past.
Events and figures.
Is full of nuances.
We think we already know.
And multiple perspectives.
Yeah. And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? That constant exploration and discovery.
What makes history so fascinating?
It really makes you wonder if Eisenhower were president today.
Right.
How would he approach
that constant exploration
of justice
and discovery
issues we're facing now?
It really makes you wonder.
Would he?
If Eisenhower were president today,
still favor.
How would he approach?
that cautious, pragmatic approach?
It's social justice issues.
Or would he take on a more
we're facing now
activist role?
That's such
It's impossible to say for sure.
a thought-provoking question.
It's a great question to consider
Would he
as we continue to grapple with these issues today.
still favor that cautious, pragmatic approach?
It really highlights how
Would he take our
history isn't just about the past.
a more activist role?
It's about connecting the past to the present.
It's impossible to say for sure.
And using those insights
But it's a great question
to inform our future.
to consider
Big thanks to that History Podcast episode
as we continue to grapple
for giving us so much to unpack about Eisenhower's
with these issues today.
civil rights legacy. And to our listener,
really highlights how
we hope this has given you a new perspective.
History isn't just about the past.
On this pivotal moment in American history,
it's about connecting.
Keep those questions coming.
The past to the present.
And keep exploring.
And using those insights to inform our future.
Thanks for listening.
Big thanks to that History Podcast episode for giving us so much to unpack about Eisenhower's civil rights legacy.
All right, see you next time.
It was a great deep dive.
Bye.
And to our listener, we hope this has given you a new perspective on this pivotal moment in American history. Keep those questions coming and keep exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.